So while our audience members think of some questions they have and put them in the chat, I'll just get us started with a few questions. So Dr. Awasthi, how did you become interested in the field of neuroscience and more specifically cognitive neuroscience and your particular research focus?
Well, first of all, I would like to thank you, Adina, and all the team members who have organized this event. My interest in neuroscience started with my undergraduate days in biology. I wanted to understand how a human system works, particularly the body and the mind. And when I wanted to understand the relationship between body and mind, neuroscience is an area that looks at behavior. So I thought, okay, let me start with the brain behavior relationship. And then in between, there is the mental phenomena that I was quite curious about. So I started asking questions about how the body works, and that was quite easy to answer in biology. Then I wanted to ask questions about how the mind works, and that was mostly in the domain of psychology. And then in between, I found a discipline called cognitive neuroscience that bridges this gap between mind and body. So I started with neuroscience with those kinds of questions regarding mind-body relationship.
All right, and again, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat so Dr. Awasthi can answer them. And to continue off, what was one of your favorite neuroscience projects that you have undertaken in the past?
Well, I have done quite a bit of projects. Let me think about some of those that I found particularly interesting. I think I'll talk about a project on relationship between fear and disgust in the brain. So while working in the US at Wisconsin-Madison, our lab was looking at how the brain processes different threat subtypes. So there are different kinds of threat emotions, particularly anger, fear, and disgust. And we wanted to look at if they differ in early encoding stages, which means how the brain processes them differently, if at all. So we used a method called magnetoencephalography, or measuring magnetic field at the scalp surface non-invasively. So it's a very tiny amount of magnetic field that you measure at the scalp, and then you amplify it and see the patterns. From our research, we found that actually fear and disgust, which are generally perceived as threat emotions, they're encoded quite differently and likely in different brain regions. So this was quite a revelation for us in terms of looking at different early etiology, which means in the early part of the encoding or in the early processing stages, the information is processed differently in the brain, and later on it is generalized. So we experience threat as a generalized behavior, but in the early stages of brain processing, it is quite different. Fear and disgust differ from each other.
Thank you, that was very interesting to learn about. While we wait for more people to put any questions they have in the chat, do you think learning more about the brain will improve our quality of life, and how do you think so?
I would definitely think yes, it would improve quite a bit of what and the more we learn about the brain-mind relationship and the brain-mind-body relationship, a lot of mental health issues, a lot of societal problems could be addressed in quite a systematic fashion. Because for a long time, we did not understand the relationship between mind and brain activity. We believe that sometimes people are just irresponsible, or they are not taking the right precautions, or they are not paying enough attention. Now we know that certain brain structures, if they are compromised, some people are unable to perform like the rest of the crowd. So what we call neurodiversity is a concept that has come out of understanding of brain-mind relationship in the context of behavior. So in solving a variety of problems which are of critical concern, understanding of the brain and its mechanisms related to mental phenomena is critical.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions they would like to ask?
Somebody says, can you please explain what your research focuses on? So much of my research has looked at perception, consciousness, a bit of meditation work, and decision making. So I started my PhD work in the area of visual perception. How do we see the world? Vision is a dominant sense in humans. That's the case with most primates, but primarily with humans. Almost half of the brain processes are involved in visual perception. How do we see? How do we experience? How do we make sense of the world? We also use our other sensory modalities like smell and taste and touch and sound, but vision is predominant. So I focused on vision or visual perception as my early research question. Later on, I looked at specifically what kind of emotionally relevant visual information like threat or fear are encoded in the brain. I also studied topics like visual attention, visual search. Later on, I moved into an area called neuroeconomics, which is a bit of an applied aspect of neuroscience, where we look at how people make decisions in a financially risky context or in a socially relevant context, and what are the brain mechanisms involved. So this was more of a application of what brain scientists can tell us about how people make decisions. I've also studied topics on how people make food choices and how people make choices regarding risky food choices, as well as my current work looks at how people can learn to train their brains. So a bit of mix of cognitive training, as well as how neuroplasticity can help us change our perception as well as behavior. So mostly looking at brain and its behavioral relationship.
Thank you. We also have another question. What is the best part about learning cognitive science, and would you recommend it?
Well, there are a lot of interesting aspects of learning cognitive science. One is you get to ask questions that have not been asked previously, particularly questions that talk about relationship between your body, your brain, and the societal context. Because we don't exist in a vacuum. We exist with other human beings in an environmental context, as well as with animals and plants and mountains and trees and a variety of what we call ecology and ecological context. So cognitive science is an interdisciplinary field which looks at not just the information processing happening in your head and in your body, but also its interaction with the world. So you learn quite a bit about the rest of the world and how it helps you navigate and operate. So I definitely recommend this area for a variety of reasons, both from curiosity point of view, but also from career point of view. There are a lot of opportunities which have applications from cognitive science into technology or in policy, even in marketing, as well as design, besides doing fundamental research in clinical or even technology settings. So I highly recommend this area for anybody.
And then we have another question. Does cognitive science and your research overlap with any other fields in neuroscience? And if so, which ones?
I would say cognitive neuroscience is a subdiscipline within cognitive science, which looks at the neural instantiation or the brain basis of cognition. So there are cognitive psychologists who may not pay much attention to the brain activity, whereas cognitive neuroscientists do care a lot about brain activity. So obviously cognitive neuroscience is an area which overlaps both cognitive science and neuroscience. Besides that, there is an area called neurobiology that studies the biological basis of behavior, mostly in animal systems, but also in humans at times. So there is definitely overlap between neurobiology and cognitive science. There is an area called systems biology. There are other subdisciplines within neuroscience, like cellular and molecular neurosciences that deal with animal behavior, for instance. In those cases, understanding behavior from a neuro point of view is relevant. So there is definitely an overlap there.
All right, thank you. And does anyone else have any other questions they'd like to ask? And while they do that, another question I have would be, oh, here's one. Where did you get your degrees from?
So my degree started in India. I did my first degree, which is an undergraduate degree, which is a bachelor's in life sciences from University of Pune. I also did a master's from the same university. I studied insects in the beginning. I was an entomologist with my first master's degree. Then I did a master's in consciousness studies from BITS Pilani, which is in Technological University in India. Following that, I did a PhD in cognitive neurosciences from Macquarie University in Sydney. So in terms of degrees, I have done education mostly in India and in Australia.
And feel free to keep putting questions you have in the chat. Another one, like just in general, would be how can students show their interest in neuroscience at a young age?
Sorry, I didn't get your question.
How can students show their interest in neuroscience at a young age?
Wow, something like what you're doing right now. This kind of organizational setup, even from a startup point of view or from early stages, gives you a lot of exposure to what is happening in the field. So students can join forums and programs like yours. They can also join something called Society for Neuroscience, which has a lot of information for the public. I believe a variety of research institutions, both in India and the rest of the world, offer now undergraduate research opportunities, both in a systematic fashion, but also in informal settings. You can become a research assistant. Sometimes you can volunteer in certain projects at research institutions. There's a lot of information now available on the web regarding resources for learning about neuroscience, both out of curiosity, but also from a career perspective. So there's a lot of opportunity. And I highly recommend something what you're doing today, which is interacting with experts in the field and bringing students and experts together.
Thank you. And we have some more questions in the chat. So one of our audience members says that they have a biomedical technology background, but they're not sure what area of neuroscience to go into. What do you suggest that this person should consider when making a choice of area to venture in, especially for masters?
Well, biomedical is a very, very relevant area for neurosciences. First thing is you will have a lot of understanding of the biomedical fundamentals, these sciences that constitute this field that can have a lot of bearing on neuroscience research. Secondly, you can actually bring much valuable skills in statistics and programming and mathematical, as well as engineering training environments that can be of critical use in fields like computational neuroscience or computational cognitive neuroscience, or even neural nets, or in a variety of other settings where there is application orientation of neuroscience. Of course, you can choose to do a cognitive neuroscience masters with this kind of background, and you would be a very good candidate for those, besides having application orientation with bringing in biomedical training into a cognitive context. So definitely that background is a good mix.
Right. And then our next question is, on a basis of cognitive behavior, are there certain behaviors that are alike, or does it all differ depending on the patient?
Cognitive behavior in the context of patients. Can you please repeat the question? Or
yes.
Okay. So can we alike, or does it all differ depending on the patient? Now, if I understand the question correctly, you're asking if all the behaviors are alike. Generally, behavior is an output of the nervous system, and behavior is generally in relation to what is expected in the environment and how your brain is processing that information. In some patients, the information processing is not typical. Let us say people with schizophrenia, for instance, do not exhibit typical behavior. Why? There is some understanding that the brain is processing information differently. That's one part. And secondly, maybe the context also changes the output. So you don't behave the same way in different environments. You behave differently in different environments based on the environmental input. So behavior is definitely a critical component, and it differs from patient to patient if you're discussing different patients, because different brain areas can be compromised, or their processing can be compromised. And a different context can also influence a change in behavior.
Thank you. And our next question is, knowing how lucrative entomology is and its applications in forensics, why did you decide to switch careers and what prompted it?
Well, I was quite curious about how the mind works, or what is the relationship between mind and brain. I know that entomology had a lot of application value, particularly right from, doing integrated pest management, because pests or insects are a large proportion of all living beings on the planet, and they have quite unique genetic history. So learning and studying insects could have been a very good career path. Now, when I look back in retrospect, I see, okay, I could have combined both entomology with animal behavior or insect behavior and developed, drones or systems that can fly and process information simultaneously and could be of relevance for applied context. But at the time, I was quite curious about the mind. And I thought that it's very hard to understand the mind of an insect because you can't ask an insect, what are you thinking? And you can just observe their behavior. In contrast, you can ask human beings, what are they thinking? And they can tell you quite reliably at times what they're thinking. And then we can correlate that self-report or those questionnaire-based surveys to brain and body activity. So I wanted to understand human behavior and human mind and the relationship between the brain and the behavior. So I moved, or rather switched my career more towards consciousness and cognition. Also at the time, I was quite curious about the nature of consciousness. That was my master's degree. The second master's I did, that played some critical role in that switch.
All right, thank you. And then our next question is, as someone who likes to go deep and work on a variety of topics and not go super deep into just one topic, do you think a cognitive neuroscientist would be a niche field? And do you think that there is a lot of variety in this field?
Definitely, there are possibilities to go very deep in certain aspects, and then you can still be a generalist cognitive neuroscientist. Now, within cognitive neuroscience, there are various subdisciplines that people specialize in. Some people focus on visual perception, and within that, they will focus on, let us say, higher level perception versus lower level perception. For instance, they will focus on object perception versus face perception. Within face perception, some of them will focus on identity perception versus expression perception. So you can have super specializations within the bigger domain of just visual perception or visual perception of the world. Again, you can have a variety of applications. So you can just be a generalist and apply most of these findings in a variety of settings, whether it's policy or business or marketing or even consulting. So both directions are quite feasible, and there are a variety of options available.
Thank you. Next question is, what method do you use to diagnose a mental disorder or any irregular behavior?
Well, I'm not a clinician, so I generally don't diagnose mental disorders directly. I collaborate with other experts, generally psychiatrists or clinical psychologists who are experts in diagnosing clinical conditions. We work with them to understand the etiology or the relationship between brain processes and that behavior. And of course, we use a variety of methods like subjective self-reports or assessments using questionnaire-based methods. You can also do surveys, but also my colleagues can do specific types of clinical tests. These are called test batteries, standardized test batteries. They have been studied for quite some time on a variety, quite a large number of patient groups to have some validity. You can also scan some people's brains to understand the relationship between the brain processes and the clinical conditions. And finally, you have a triangulation approach, which means you combine all of them together, not just one method, but a brain activity measurement or a behavioral measurement. Sometimes some lesion studies. So psychiatrists and neurologists can study your brain invasively or non-invasively to study if your brain structures are lesioned. And that can also have a critical role in diagnosing a condition.
Great, thank you. And then our next question is, do you think studying behavioral changes in patients with neurodegenerative diseases is a great way to learn more about how they manifest to the body?
I would say yes, behavior is a critical component. Unless a behavior changes, people external to the family or generally other than the patient cannot figure out what is wrong with the person or if there is something unusual. Of course, a patient also feels, they can also experience changes in their perception, their emotional states, their capacity to pay attention, for instance, or motivation. Many of these conditions are compromised, or let us say are different from typical people who do not have this clinical condition. So observation of behavior is important. When you go to a neurologist, for instance, they would generally test your behavior. They will ask you to perform certain tasks. and they will see if you're able to perform those tasks, whether you're following those commands correctly or not, whether eye movements are proper or not, how you are responding, are you able to speak, if they give you some tasks to respond, etc. So behavior definitely plays an important role in diagnosis. But it's not the only one. Of course, as I mentioned previously, brain measurements using an EEG method, or even a functional MRI or a functional MRI method, can help in diagnosing a condition.
Thank you. And then our most recent question was, what were your major challenges in switching careers, and how has COVID-19 affected your research?
Well, when you move from life sciences into a psychology domain, there were certain methodological differences that I found that were quite challenging in the beginning. Initially, I thought, why do psychologists look at this phenomena differently from biologists? I came from a biology background. I looked at everything, or most cognitive phenomena, from a bio or neurobio angle, whereas my psychology colleagues, or even colleagues with linguistics background, did not care much about the biological foundations. So sometimes we believed we were talking about the same thing, but we had different underlying assumptions. So it takes a while to get used to the terminologies that may have the same meaning, but they actually differ in their intuition. There were different methods that psychologists were using, or even neuroscientists were using. Some of my colleagues with mathematics or computer science background.
I'm sorry about that. Did my audio cut off?
The other part, I think, was about COVID-19. Yes.
Oh, sorry, my audio cut off, so I wasn't sure if there was any issues or not. Sorry about that.
Yes. Somebody asked about COVID-19. It definitely affected much of the work across the globe. And because currently I'm looking at cognitive training through a digital format, COVID-19 did not have much of a direct impact on my current work on training people using digital therapy for cognitive rehabilitation. But it did affect some of the in-person interactions with our clients, or sometimes with our patient groups.
Great, thank you. And then our next question is, are you looking forward to any breakthroughs in cognitive science, and if so, in which topic?
Well, I would say first point is the current area that I'm involved in is digital cognitive therapy. This is something that is going to be quite relevant for the future. We will have a lot of mental health issues that need to be addressed, both from a pandemic-like situation, or accessibility of resources in remote locations of the world. So I believe a digital cognitive therapy, or a digital approach to cognitive rehabilitation, will be something that is exciting for the future. Another area is what I call neurotechnologies. We had a session before this on neurotechnologies, so I believe many of you are quite familiar with the topic. I believe non-invasive brain stimulation in a controlled and a more precise context would be of great help in addressing cognitive improvements as well as rehabilitation issues.
Thank you. And does anyone else have any questions they would like to ask? Okay. What methods do you use to update your knowledge on advancements in your field?
I attend sessions like this to learn about what's happening in the field. Secondly, I read research articles that are relevant to my own research through a variety of channels. I receive, regular updates through, mailing lists about conferences, where I learn about what is the, focus of, or the theme of the conference, what kind of research topics are being presented. I still present much of my research both in an academic and an applied context. So I learn from other speakers and experts in the field. So I keep up to date with what's happening in the area, both within my specialization as well as in the broader context.
Right. And then our next question is, can cognitive neuroscience be applied to tackling climate change, and how?
Well, that's a wonderful question. Yes, understanding human cognitive limitations, both from a behavioral point of view, but also from neural information processing point of view, biases we have, or cognitive limitations, or emotional unconscious, can help us direct certain kind of behavior or avoid certain kind of behavior that has policy implications. So I'm interested also in applied context of cognitive neuroscience into policy and in governance. And definitely a lot of research can tell us about why human beings choose a certain path over other. Why do we choose, for instance, short-term benefits over long-term goals? So cognitive neuroscience can be very helpful in tackling bigger issues like climate change.
Okay, thank you. And then our next question is, what skills and qualities are expected when you become a scientist?
I would say scientists come in various shapes and sizes. We don't necessarily should focus on one particular or a specific typical profile of a scientist, because science comes out of curiosity. Science is a social phenomenon, and every human being or every animal is quite curious about the environment. So to be a scientist, one has to be curious, and one has to keep up with that curiosity, despite some of the setbacks or challenges might come across. So some of the critical points are the ability to ask right questions and not give up when there are limitations or setbacks. Secondly, to seek out alternative point of views and not remain tied to what you think is your preferred approach or preferred vantage point. Scientist has to have the capacity, or to develop that capacity, to entertain an opposing point of view at the same time holding your point of view, so that you can evaluate and be ready to give up your own so-called intuitions, because science is a phenomena that doesn't necessarily rely on individual or subjective evaluations. We need objective evaluations as well as consensus. There's definitely space for consensus. That's how science also works. We need to have experiments and methods that can be replicated across different settings with different types of backgrounds and different contexts. Secondly, people from various backgrounds should come into sciences, not just people from STEM training, but also from other domains that can influence science. For instance, philosophy, which is a critical component of doing science. Most of our degrees are in philosophy of science. PhDs or DPhils, they are actually degrees in philosophy of that subject. And same as I mentioned, science is a social activity. So there are many of these social, political, environmental contexts that influence how science is done. So one also needs to be aware of how those factors influence scientists as well as the process of science. So there is not one approach, but definitely one needs to keep their mind open, be prepared for challenges, as well as learning about new things.
Great, thank you. And then our next question is, someone is asking if you could kindly tell us about the idea of behavioral science insights for business development organized by you.
So over the last few years, I've been interested in applying cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience into societal problem solving. So I saw that a lot of individual as well as business decisions are made with a lot of limitations. We call them cognitive biases or even unconscious influences. Human beings are considered rational beings according to economic theory, but neuroscience or cognitive neuroscience tells us that we are not necessarily very rational. We make decisions based on how we are feeling, both in terms of our body, but also in relationship to environment. Human beings also make decisions which are generally short-term and are driven by impulses rather than by systematic planning. So when we are aware of these cognitive biases, we can actually make a business decision or a policy decision with certain caveats that we may not be able to see what is going to come in 10 years from now or 20 years from now. So cognitive neuroscience can actually help us overcome certain biases by structuring our policy and business decision in a way that is independent of individual whims and fancies and limitations. This is an area called behavioral insights or nudge theory that has become quite popular in the last decade or so.
Great, thank you. And our next question is it ethical to collect data of clients in digital therapeutics that could be used in better understanding the patient's problems?
Much of science actually moves, much of experimental science definitely moves based on data. Today, there is a lot of interest in gathering data, not just from patients, but also from regular users. So when we do any experiments with in the clinical context, we are following certain guidelines. They are laid down by international organizations as well as bodies within the local context, generally a university environment or a research context. Our research goes through an assessment process, an ethical assessment, whether we can collect data and what kind of data is being collected. We generally collect data in an anonymized fashion, and then we analyze the data. We report only certain aspects in an anonymized fashion, which is relevant for making an informed decision regarding the outcomes of that research. We have to be very careful regarding collecting data, and there is definitely a need for informed consent. So whenever we collect data from human subjects, because I work with human subjects, we inform all our participants regarding what is the purpose of the study, how we are going to collect the data, and how we are going to process it and publish it. So it is generally collected with, always collected with informed consent and is anonymized. So definitely there are a lot of ethical guidelines that are followed and should be followed across the globe. And of course, the ethical bodies are involved in this process all the way up to the end. When you publish an article or you send your final data for publication, research journal generally asks for the declaration and the details of how the ethical guidelines were followed and what were the details of the ethical body that approved the study.
All right, thank you. And then our next question is knowing a programming language a necessity for the future? And if so, what languages would you recommend for a beginner?
Now, for a future in cognitive neuroscience, yes, because we deal with a lot of data, as I mentioned, and much of this data is being processed through advanced devices that require automation. It saves your time as well as it can help you pick and choose certain aspects of the data to analyze. So generally, a variety of programming environments are being used. For a beginner, let us say, if you are keen, you can start with a programming language like Python. That is much easier, and it has widespread application both in cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience.
Thank you. And then our next question is, aside from the psychological angle to cognitive neuroscience, are there much different opportunities for the biologically inclined neuroscientist?
I would say, in addition to psychology, if you are biologically inclined, you can look at clinical aspects. You can look at systems neuroscience, because there is a lot that needs to be discovered and understood in terms of molecular and cellular mechanisms and how you can influence brain processes using those. In the last decade or so, a variety of variety of neurobiological techniques like optogenetics have become quite popular. They may not necessarily be inspired by a psychological angle, but they are definitely biologically very relevant. You can also study specific types of model organisms to look at brain behavior relationship in the neuroscience domain.
Thank you. And does anyone else have any other questions they would like to ask? And I don't see any. So this one over here would be, do you have a message or any advice for any of our aspiring scientists out there?
Well, first of all, I congratulate all of you to you have taken the first step in trying to figure out and learn about what's happening in the field by joining such an important event. I do not have a specific message. I would say keep your eyes and minds open, learn about things. Do not believe everything that's available on the internet, because science, you need to be able to learn how to decipher good quality evidence from popular media, or sometimes social media driven messaging regarding science. Science is a social activity, so all of us are involved in progress in the scientific domain, not just scientists but also people. But for people who are not necessarily trained in science, it's important that you pay attention to what is happening, what is being presented in the regular social media domain mostly, but also sometimes in the mainstream media, and whether there is enough evidence to back that claim. In the last decade or so, with the advent of social media and access, which is quite good, on one hand, the amount of trust and reliability on scientific evidence might have changed a bit, I believe, across the globe. Now it also differs from region to region, but I would say one needs to learn about how to separate the wheat from the chaff, essentially look at whether evidence supports certain claim or not, and how strong is that evidence. In fact, scientists are always in that process of trying to evaluate evidence. When we do scientific publications or conferences, or most of the interactions with other scientists, they're actually evaluating and testing whether this makes sense and whether it goes with the fundamental tenets. Sometimes some new evidence comes and that doesn't align with what is known. We should not discard that, but we should keep an open mind, as I mentioned in the beginning, and that is a critical component. And secondly, because the field is being driven by a lot of technological innovation, one needs to also include societal implications of what we are doing. When we ask certain kind of questions, we also need to be prepared for difficult, or rather some uncomfortable dialogue that needs to happen regarding ethical aspects, regarding social inclusion, regarding equity in going forward with what kind of questions are asked, and participation in the knowledge generation, which is the field of science. So both evaluation of scientific evidence, but also who is doing that science and how are we including a variety of viewpoints in generating scientific and credible evidence.
All right, thank you. And as we come to our concluding questions, some of our last few audience members have asked, are you open for any collaborations?
Yes, I'm open for all kinds of collaborations. So please reach out to me. I'm available on my email at bhuvaneshawasthi@gmail.com, bhuvanesh.awasthi@gmail.com, as well as on social media, on LinkedIn and Twitter.
And then our last comment asked if there is an email that we could reach out to you.
Yes, so my email is my first name dot last name @gmail.com. That's bhuvanesh.awasthi@gmail.com.
All right, and I believe those are all the questions that we have here. So thank you, Dr. Awasthi, for joining us for this fireside chat, and it's been very insightful learning all this from you. And they asked if you could type out your email in the chat, please.
Yes. Generally, a Google search will tell you quite a bit about my connections, or rather how to reach me, but this is good.
Right, and then while you type out your email, okay. And then they also asked if they could contact you via LinkedIn.
Yes, definitely. All of you are welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn. I look forward to learning more from your kind of questions and these kinds of events, because generally the youthful energy is very critical in asking relevant questions and driving the field forward.
Okay, and again, thank you again, Dr. Awasthi, for this. And it's been very insightful and interested in learning from all these questions that our audience members have had. And thank you everyone for joining us. We'll be hopping off this Zoom meet shortly. And if you're interested in connecting with any of the other people in our student neuroscience community, make sure to join our networking social session over Glimpse at 11 a.m. EST. And make sure to join us back for our next speaker session with Shriya Naidu at 11:30 a.m. EST.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Dina, for this wonderful session.
Thank you again.